Brilliant. Welcome everyone to our second provocation of our Festival for Change. We had Nicholas Gruen this morning talking about the corruption of public focused processes due to competition. This evening, I'm very pleased to have Rupert Read here, who apart from being an experienced and well-known academic based at the University of East Anglia, is also one of the UK spokespeople for Extinction Rebellion and one of the intellects behind their thinking on systems change, which is why we really asked him, because this whole event is really about thinking how system change can happen. So he's been in the middle of it. And actually, I quoted Rupert in the morning. We were talking about innovations and models of innovations, and I quoted XR as an example of a major innovation in a social movement, and obviously a really important example to learn from in terms of how it drew on past ideas. And so it's great to have you here to talk more about this topic. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you to get going.
Great, thanks, Henry. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here, especially on this fascinating new platform. And what I propose to do is just to talk for a fairly short amount of time in a provocative way. And then maybe you might want to ask me one or two questions, Henry, and you and I could talk for a little while, and then we'll open it out more generally to questions and allow some proper scrutiny from those on the floor. But I'm going to keep it fairly short because we're not a huge group, and I figure the best way to use our time will be to engage in some real dialogue. So how can I be provocative? Well, I'm going to say this. There are innumerable people out there, and I'm sure that many of those at your festival are in this category, who are at this time giving us the important and natural and welcome message that now is a time when everything can change, and now is a time when we from the coronavirus pandemic, and now is a time for potential great transition. And I'm here to say that while there's a sense in which all of that is completely true, there's another sense in which it's not. And the sense in which it's not is we are now fooling ourselves if we think that what is potentially about to happen is a system change of the kind we really need, with the speed that we really need to avoid further disasters and catastrophes. There are more disasters coming for certain. Some of them may well be further and potentially much worse pandemics. Some of them will certainly be worsening climate disasters. Tragically, some degree of climate breakdown is now baked into the system because of time lags in the system, because of feedbacks that have been unleashed. And yeah, absolutely, this is a moment when we should be engaging in a profound reset from the COVID pandemic and the COVID lockdown. But to a considerable extent, we are already not doing that. So I look out my window, for example, and I hear an increasing volume of traffic noise week on week, and a starting up again of plane travel. If we had, as a species, as a society, been fully serious in responding, if you will, to the provocation of COVID-19, we would already have adapted and transformed much more thoroughly than we have. Don't get me wrong, this moment is not over. Nothing's over till it's over. There is everything to fight for, and in a certain sense, everything to play for, just as much as there was before. But it is now foolish to think that we can attain the kinds of results we would have liked to have attained if we'd have started 3 months ago, let alone 3 decades ago. Because the great difference between the pandemic and the climate and ecological emergency is that the former was a kind of massively speeded up version of the latter in terms of being a crisis. The pandemic unfolded in a matter of weeks. The climate and ecological emergency unfolds over a period of decades. We are already decades late. Now, this coronavirus crisis is the last chance for a thorough reset. But as I say, to some extent, that is already was, because we are already to a very large extent resetting in the wrong way. Of course, this varies by country. Some countries are doing a lot better than others. So, for example, just as New Zealand responded very well to the coronavirus pandemic in a precautious way and has suffered, immeasurably less deaths than the UK or the US. So, to some extent, the policies being pursued by the New Zealand government in terms of what they propose to do with the economy over the next couple of decades, in terms of what they propose to do to economic measures such as gross domestic product, namely to get rid of it and replace it with something better, that points us in the kind of direction we need to be going in. It's not enough, but it's the right kind of direction. This country, the UK, is steaming full speed ahead fairly much in the wrong direction. Not quite full steam ahead. I mean, that's more what's happening in America and Brazil, but not far off it. So that's my uncomfortable message, that we are in the process right now of missing our last chance for the kind of radical reset that we need. And I say our last chance for the following reason. These opportunities for reset do not come along all the time. The last such opportunity we had was probably over a decade ago with the financial crisis. That opportunity was squandered. This opportunity has not been completely squandered yet, and some good things are happening. You look at what's happening, for example, in Paris with the massive innovations encouraging far more cycling. You look at what's been happening even in this country in terms of positive developments, such as the enormous upsurge of care and love and respect for our National Health Service, in terms of people talking about valuing nature more and so on and so forth. In terms of the rise of video conferencing and reductions in commuting. These are all hopeful and positive signs, but they are nowhere near enough. And unless we were to take this opportunity for a full-scale reset, we shouldn't expect another one to come along for 5, 10, 15 years. And we have been told very clearly by the scientists and by the UN Secretary General, for example, that if we're going to engage in an adequate reset to prevent a climate catastrophe, we need to start on it now, this year. We knew that already before the pandemic. So that's why I say we are squandering right now our last chance. As I said earlier, this does not mean that we're completely doomed. This absolutely does not mean that there's no point in doing anything. Very far from it. There's always a point in trying to make things better or less bad, however terrible things are. But I want to provoke people by urging that now is the moment to give up on our hopes that we had cherished for many years of bringing about the full scale, at speed, at depth transformation that we had so desperately hoped for and wished for and planned for, so many of us, and have been active in trying to create for such a long time. This is a very uncomfortable message, the message I'm giving. It's a message which will perhaps be especially hard to hear for younger people, but it's especially for the benefit of younger people that I think it's essential to give this message and to give the unalloyed truth. Because the longer people go on pretending that we're going to have a full, beautiful Green New Deal across the whole world, and it's going to be enough, and it's going to stop climate disasters in their track, and we're not going to have to deal with significant amounts of mortality and societal collapse over the coming generation or two. The longer people carry on pretending that, the less well prepared we are to engage in the actions that actually need to be taken now, including the need not just to mitigate against climate damage, but to adapt to the climate damage that is here and is baked in. If we do not adequately adapt, then that just increases our unresilience and increases the likely scale of the death and suffering that is coming. So I think that maybe is enough to get us started. You've been looking puzzled a lot of the time when I've been speaking, Henry. I take that as a good sign. I take that as a sign that I'm being suitably provocative. And I recall the response of one of Wittgenstein's teachers to him. Wittgenstein is my favorite philosopher, great philosopher from the last century, who was in a class of the great English philosopher G.E. Moore. And Bertrand Russell, Wittgenstein's other teacher, said to Moore after one of the classes, "So Moore, how do you find our new German student, Herr Wittgenstein?" And Moore responded, "I like him very much. He's the only one of my students who looks puzzled in my lectures." So I always welcome people looking puzzled. So tell me what you think of what I said so far.
Well, yeah, I'm very much in your space in that we have to accept that the climate is changing, and humans generally, they have to see and experience things before they act. That models and predictions by experts and things, they're very intangible. They don't really sort of grab. They don't make people, and it's an interesting contrast of the pandemic. The pictures of numbers of people, of bodies, of the collapse of health services was obviously incredibly powerful. Now it's interesting, of course, previously we'd had pictures of the fires in Australia, which were huge, and one wonders what sort of impacts that those are going to have in terms of space. We've got huge swarms of locusts in Africa, floods. And I suppose, how far does that sort of trigger? I mean, I suppose there was something simple about the pandemic, or relatively simple about the sort of responses, in spite of the fact people didn't need to, a lot didn't respond in at all a sensible manner. So we are without doubt going to have to adapt. So what do you see, and this festival is about ideas, innovations that respond to how the future is going to be. So what sort of innovations do you think we need to allow us to better adapt to the sort of changes in climate that we're going to see? Obviously, we don't know how that's going to go. There's going to be crises and there's going to be more general trends. What do you see as those sort of adaptations needed?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a huge question, of course, but I'll attempt to start making an answer to it. So a central part of my message, and something which I think you'll be hearing more from people associated with Extinction Rebellion over the next several months, because with the passage of time and with increasing clarity that we're not getting the level of transformation that we need, and frankly, it was never likely that we would, but it was always worth a try. The more the time goes by, the more urgent and necessary it becomes to talk about adaptation. The crucial thing that we need to do in terms of adaptation is to make sure that we adapt in the right way. So what's the wrong way of adapting? The wrong way of adapting is what I and my colleague Jem Bendell call shallow adaptation, which is what mostly has been called adaptation so far. It means basically trying to perpetuate the current system while recognizing, while facing up to the reality, at least to some extent, that climate and ecological damage is here to stay. It means, to take an example, things like building higher seawalls and building bigger concrete flood defenses, because you're recognizing river flooding and sea flooding and damage and sea level rise and so on. It's going to be worse and worse. So you try to cope with that by insulating yourself against it, by building higher seawalls, etc. That is inherently fragile, bound eventually to fail, and in itself damaging psychologically, because it gives one the illusion that we can carry on with the current system. And also damaging in very real and practical terms, because if you pour enormous resources into, say, building hard flood defenses, that's a lot of resources that you're not using for a better purpose, and a lot of resources in particular that is being poured into carbon-intensive infrastructure, which hard flood defenses are. So what are the kinds of adaptation that we need to engage in? Well, the key kind we need to engage in is what is called transformative adaptation. And that's what has been an idea which has been around for some time, but it needs to be much better known. It's central to the work that my think tank Greenhouse has been doing, especially in our project on facing up to climate reality. See if I can put something in the chat about that, in case people want to follow up on it. So in our Facing Up to Climate Reality project and book, we set out various ways in which transformative adaptation needs to be engaged in, and there's a link in the general chat. And what does transformative adaptation mean? Well, it means that unlike a shallow adaptation, what you try to do is to create a win-win-win. You try to work with nature rather than against nature. You try to engage in adaptation that is simultaneously mitigative, simultaneously making climate damage and ecological damage more generally less bad, and adaptation that is simultaneously seeking to co-create the kind of flourishing new society that we need to create, which is necessarily going to be a more energy descended society and a more localized society. We're going to be moving away from globalization. That is certain. It's already started with the coronavirus pandemic. And it's certain because if we try to keep hypermobile globalization, economic globalization going, that just makes it more certain that there will be a collapse, in which case there'll be a very brutal form of relocalization. So the question is, can you have transformative adaptation at scale, which creates a beneficial form of relocalization, where much more of the food that we eat, for example, is going to be grown locally? And of course, what's really good about this agenda of transformative adaptation is that it's something that can be done and should be done on the macro level by states, but it's also something that everybody can engage in. It's to some extent exactly what is being already done by organizations such as the Transition Towns movement, or by many permaculturalists, for example. So transformative adaptation is, I think, an idea whose time has very much come, precisely for that reason. Finally, there is deep adaptation, and deep adaptation is adaptation that says maybe collapse is going to happen. If so, we'd better be prepared for it. And tragically, that is also now something that we do need to engage in, because at the very least, we cannot guarantee any longer that our societies are not going to collapse in the next generation or two. Some would say we're already seeing evidence of collapse in some societies around the world. I would say, yeah, well, there's some truth in that, but also you ain't seen nothing yet. So deep adaptation is kind of insurance against that kind of future possibility. Deep adaptation alone is not enough. But if you have deep adaptation while centering your resources on what we've called transformative adaptation, then I think you're heading very much in the right direction.
And I mean, often people talk about two different types of adaptation, sort of technical adaptation and social adaptation.
Yeah.
When you talk about transformative deep transformation, are you talking more about social adaptation, changing the structures of our society, or what's the balance between technical and social?
Well, it's very much both. And clearly there's going to be a role in the future, insofar as there is a future for renewable energy, for example, and there'll be a need for continued innovation in that. My own view is that most of the coming renewable energy will be relatively small scale again, and relatively local, but that to some extent is something that remains to be seen. My own view is that if one had to choose, as it were, between social and technical adaptation, which you don't, you need both. But if one had to choose, then actually social adaptation is more important. And too much of the discourse so far has been about technical adaptation only. And too much of that discourse really has, as I hinted a few minutes ago, been about shallow adaptation. When you get serious about transformative and deep adaptations, it's clear that we need psychological change, and that we need sociological change, and that we need political change. As I say, the good thing is that you can get some of that political change happening even if you don't get buy-in from states, as at the present time we're unlikely to get in countries such as the UK or the US. So I think that we need adaptation across the piece, but the most important adaptation of all, perhaps, and in a way it has to come first as well as last, is the adaptation that we undertake, the adaptation that is involved in facing up to climate reality, as my think tank puts it, and recalibrating our hopes for the future, and recalibrating our intentions.
And I mean, you mentioned New Zealand as being maybe a country that's sort of doing better, and obviously to some extent, obviously, the personality of the Prime Minister is seen as great. And actually, there is a sort of story that a lot of the best countries were led by women as well. But is there something about, what sorts of societies do you think are going to be better at adapting than others? And, if you were going to move somewhere, where would you move?
Well, I confess I've been tempted by the idea of moving to New Zealand. Perhaps a lot of us have been. I think the upcoming New Zealand election is very interesting to watch. It looks as though what's going to happen is that the Greens are going to do well, and that the Labour Party, led by Jacinda Ardern, are going to do just astoundingly well, and that the other parties, especially the right-wing parties, are going to do really quite poorly. That's going to be a very interesting result to see in a democratic country, or a somewhat democratic country. No country in the world is really a democracy at this point, without citizens' assemblies and so forth. In terms of countries that have done very badly, I've already hinted at some of the obvious culprits. The US and Brazil are top of the list. Then there's other countries not far behind, including the UK. And there's a fascinating correspondence between the countries which have done worst on pandemic preparedness, etc., and the countries that are doing worst on climate and ecological emergency preparedness. They're basically the same countries. As I say, one very helpful way, I think, to think of the coronavirus pandemic is it's a sort of massively speeded up version of the climate and ecological emergency. It contains most of the same fundamental issues, just on speed, as it were. And of course, it's important to be clear, and there should have been more emphasis on this, and there needs to be more emphasis on it. It's important to be clear that the coronavirus pandemic is itself part of the climate and ecological emergency. It may have been probabilified by climate damage. It certainly seems to have come from ecological damage. It certainly seems to have been vectored by mistreatment of animals, and it has without any doubt been massively vectored by plane travel. The number one culprit in terms of rising emissions in our climate problem right now. People talk about super spreaders in relation to the coronavirus crisis. The real super spreaders are planes. That's why this pandemic spread around the world so much faster than the Spanish flu pandemic in the 1920s. Just absolutely clear and simple fact. So if we want to prevent future pandemics, one of the best things we can do is rein in international air travel, which is exactly the same as one of the very best things we can do in order to rein in climate damage. The coronavirus pandemic is part of the climate and ecological emergency. And when you look at the countries which have dealt with the situation worst, they are countries which are resistant to allowing a beneficial role for the state. They're countries which are prepared to engage in authoritarian behavior, but more with regard to politics than with regard to economics. They're countries which are resistant to reducing economic activity. This is very explicit in terms of the UK. Boris Johnson gave a speech, it's worth looking up, on February the 3rd, where he said quite clearly, there is this new virus, the coronavirus. Many countries are clamping down on freedom of movement and clamping down on air travel and so on to try to resist it. The UK is not going to do that. We're going to allow everything to remain open. We're going to keep our economy going. We're going to try and get a competitive advantage out of it. Of course, it was utterly stupid and short-sighted because we ended up having a far worse crisis than those other countries, including economically. Yes. But that was their ideology. Their ideology was, we are not willing to interfere with the economy. And that's the same ideology that is sending us on a fast track right now to climate and ecological oblivion.
Actually, of course, Sweden is a slightly interesting outlier on this, isn't it? But they're both lanes. But you wouldn't think immediately they were the climate change baddies. Let me now open the floor to Q&A. Please. We've got quite a lot of stuff in there. So let's see. Can everyone look at the Q&A? So can people vote? We've got 5 there. Can other people look at the questions? We've got Adam. Adam's got lots up. Can people start with, we got, that's interesting. We got lots on 0, but we seem to have 3 votes on my parents say I would be throwing my life away if I got arrested for XR. Are they correct? Okay, Rupert, let's start with that.
Yeah, so these are fascinating questions. Thank you so much for them. That's a really important personal, practical question. There are a number of dimensions to it. Look, the first thing to say here is that everybody needs to make these decisions carefully for themselves, and everyone's situation is different. And that there is no kind of hierarchy of judgment in Extinction Rebellion. For every person who is willing to get arrested, there need to be many more people standing behind them who are not, people who are giving them support, whether that be emotional support or media support or practical support or financial support. So that's the first thing to say. Would you be throwing your life away? Well, I don't think you would, unless you've got some very, very particular plan with regard to your life that means, for example, you must have a 100% clean criminal record. You might, for example, have difficulties becoming a police officer if you get a significant criminal record. But there are actually very few jobs where getting an arrest or a conviction for a relatively low-grade crime contains a big career risk in it. It's also worth adding, of course, that the assumption that you're throwing your career away if you get arrested with XR unfortunately rests on the presupposition that there are going to be careers in the conventional sense for the next 40 to 50 years or something like that. That assumption can no longer be taken for granted. And in particular, that assumption is likely to prove false unless there is massive, radical, transformative action ASAP. So there's a kind of paradox or a sort of chicken and egg situation here. The only way we get to a situation where it might turn out that some people have thrown their careers away by getting arrested is if enough people get arrested to ensure that there are careers for people to have.
That's a very interesting point. I want to take, there was one question that got to the top, everyone voted on, then it sort of disappeared. I don't know where it went, but this was, are these forms of adaptation based on incentives without facing irreversible, devastating consequences? How can we encourage adaptation by the private sector and big businesses besides campaigning? So, yeah.
Yes, that's another really good question. Look, one reason for being optimistic about the adaptation story that I've told is that you face less of the so-called tragedy of the commons with adaptation than you do with mitigation. So when people or countries, let's take countries, when countries reduce their climate change impacts, that benefits everybody around the world, which is great. But the level of that benefit for the country itself is relatively small. So people are, unfortunately, in a way, selfishly incentivized to try to encourage others to mitigate and reduce greenhouse gas emissions and not to do it themselves. With adaptation, that's not so. With adaptation, you get the direct benefit as well as the indirect benefit, typically, of the changes that you make. So a transformative adaptation type program should actually be easier to sell, as it were, to business and, for that matter, to voters and politicians than a straight mitigation story of the kind that has been dominant until now. So I'm actually quite optimistic that if we get this right, there could be a lot of money and energy and activity and attention going into adaptation and resilience and so forth over the next decade or so. That is what has to happen. And going back to the categories that I gave you earlier, it has to be done in the right way. The danger is that too much adaptation will be shallow adaptation. That's the kind of adaptation that I can foresee, for example, happening in countries like the UK and Australia. And in fact, they've talked about this quite a lot in Australia. The government have said, yeah, look, we can see the climate is changing, so we're going to adapt, i.e. we're going to do things like build higher seawalls. And if that's the track that everybody goes down, then we're pretty badly finished.
And there's, okay, so the top question at the moment is about geoengineering.
Yeah. So geoengineering, the idea of engineering the climate of the whole planet, is an understandable idea to reach for at this desperate moment. And indeed, I think we should have the debate about geoengineering. I think we can't hide away from it any longer. I think the moral we should take from the debate is that geoengineering is basically a really terrible and dangerous idea. It's the same kind of idea that got us into the trouble that we're in. The fantasy that we can control or even predict the details of the climate system, that we can industrially manage this entire hyper complex living system of the Earth, is a really dangerous idea, and it's the exact same kind of idea that the techno fix mindset has been imposing on us for a long time now. So I make this argument in detail in the book that I gave the reference to earlier, in Facing Up to Climate Reality, which is there in the general chat. And it's chapter 6 in that book, and you can actually get it for free from the Greenhouse website. Luckily, they allow you to download that chapter for free. And I go into this point in detail there. The argument that I make there with my co-author is that geoengineering is a profoundly reckless thing, or would be a profoundly reckless thing to engage with, to engage in at this moment in time. And that what we ought to be doing is mitigating and adapting. That if we go down the geoengineering route, it almost certainly won't work. And it will simply give us the illusion that we don't have to mitigate and that we don't have to adapt, but we do.
Okay. And what trends give you most hope?
Yeah, so this is yet another interesting and important question. It's another sort of imponderable one. I've already implied that something that gives me some hope is some of what's been happening in response to the coronavirus situation. I've written about that in some detail in my new book on Extinction Rebellion. Maybe I'll put the link to that here in the Q&A, if I'm allowed to do that.
Yeah.
And this is a site at which you can download the book for free, the eJunkie site there. I've just put in the bottom of the Q&A. And there is a discussion there, particularly towards the end of the book, in the chapter called Theses on Coronavirus, where I make the argument that there are various ways in which response to coronavirus gives us exactly the hope that we need. I alluded earlier to the way in which enormous care has been shown by people to each other through the coronavirus pandemic, in mutual aid, in obeying the lockdown restrictions, unless you're Dominic Cummings, in all sorts of ways. And the appreciation that has grown in so many of us for nature and for silence and for not having planes going over our heads all the time. That is something which is, I think, profoundly hopeful. And I also alluded to the way in which in some countries, and some of this is, for example, happening in France, in some countries there is an exciting, promising political response to the coronavirus situation. More broadly, I would say that what gives me hope is the vast upsurge of radical popular protest that we've seen in the last couple of years. So my friend and colleague Greta Thunberg and the climate school strikes movement, the Extinction Rebellion, being the two primary examples, but there are a number of other examples as well. The only way in which we're going to get through this without collapse is going to be if there is massive, sustained civil resistance to what is happening. We need the kind of thing that Extinction Rebellion has been doing so far, but we need it scaled up about 100-fold to actually force change on the kind of level that needs to occur. So I'm given hope by these movements, but I'd be given a lot more hope if everybody on this call could bring a few hundred people with them and take part in the next rebellion or some such.
Brilliant. I'm going to ask Aline onto the stage, if you're willing to come, because you've got a question that's I think interesting, because it brings in a sort of maybe a different perspective. Hi, Aline. Can you unmute? Yes. Where are you from?
I'm from Mexico.
You're from Mexico. So you're saying your question, in my country, many people see the quarantine as a matter of privilege because they win their money day by day. How could these countries adapt when there is already so much inequality? So do you think Mexico, you feel, is incapable of adapting?
Yeah, in a way, because the solution for everyone is to do the quarantine. But for example, many people in my country work they are not registered as workers because they work by selling stuff in their localities, and they win their money day by day. So not working and not going out and not selling would involve not feeding their family, not being able to pay electricity or whatever. So I feel that there is a sort of privilege for some of us that can adapt to these new questions that are coming nowadays. But how could we adapt, for example, as a whole country without leaving our people behind?
Well, thanks. So if I understand you correctly, you're referring really specifically to the current coronavirus situation. And when you talk about quarantine, you mean what in England we call the lockdown, and people having to stay at home and so forth. Yeah, okay. So look, I think what the coronavirus crisis has revealed very clearly, that what is thrown into stark relief is a number of the problems, including the social problems, that were already present in our societies, but they're now much more starkly visible. And what that means is that what is required in response to them is a full and serious social, economic, and political response. So if you're going to say, for example, to people who are desperately poor, you need to stay home, then you have to ensure that those people get fed and supported. That was done, for example, in China. You know, there's much to dislike and abhor about the Chinese government, including some of the ways it dealt in the early stages with the coronavirus crisis. But what you have to admire the Chinese for is the systematic way in which they responded to the crisis and ensured, as far as I'm aware, that people who were seriously economically damaged in the short term by the crisis were also given state support. That hasn't been the case in countries like Mexico or Brazil, and that's one of the reasons why things have been so difficult there. But that just underscores all the more need for that to happen, and it shows how unacceptable it is that we live in countries that are so unequal. So really, you know, a key part of my answer to your question is that the overwhelming takeaway from the coronavirus crisis, and it's the same with the climate crisis, is that we must have more equal societies. You know, whether or not you are a socialist or not, or a left winger or not, it doesn't matter. The nature of the emergency is such that we cannot sustain these societies and keep ourselves safe while being so unequal as we are. You know, if we're going to get through the climate crisis, if we're going to mitigate and adapt adequately, the hyper-consuming, the rich, the big corporation, they have to lose a lot of their money, and that also means a lot of their power. That has to be shared. There's no other way around it. Just like it's not an ideological point. It's about the nature of the emergency. It's the same kind of point as in the Second World War. We introduced food rationing in the UK in the Second World War. That was nothing to do with having a left-wing government. It was what was required for national survival. It did make the country a lot more equal and did ensure that nobody starved, even under difficult conditions. But nobody should ever starve. right? And in any case, we're in a situation of more or less permanent emergency now. The climate and ecological emergency and more recently the coronavirus emergency show this, and they throw into a harsh light these bad features of our society. So yeah, that's the answer to my question. We must become less unequal as societies, and only if we do will it be possible to take care adequately of the people who you are rightly concerned about.
Thanks very much, David.
Thank you.
If you switch your camera off, that's brilliant. I mean, Rupert, actually, one of the things you said earlier was that we should be more localized in terms of our economy, and is that could maybe mean that we become more isolated from other areas, we become disconnected, so that and you know, we look after our locality and not bother with other areas, can it not?
Yeah. So the way to deal with that is, firstly, as the world relocalizes, it's important that we don't lose communications with each other. So my hope is that in the future, for example, we'll be able to have these kinds of worldwide conversations, but there'll be a lot less air travel. Yeah, and so we'll stay in touch. But without the rampant inequality which is demonstrated by air travel. Remember that the majority of the world's people have never flown. And in a country like the UK, the vast majority of the flights are taken by 15 to 20% of the population. So air travel is a prerogative of the rich, basically. And in terms of the risk of sort of embedding wealth disparities in, my argument is that what ought to happen is that we ought to share more wealth around the world, and make societies both externally and internally more equal. But that we shouldn't do that in the way that our current society teaches us to do it. We're told, oh, you should engage in trade so that you can improve the standard of living in other societies. But a lot of that trade is actually enormously harmful. Trade in commodities, flying in cut flowers from Africa to shops in Britain. This is all harmful. It would be much better if we simply gave money away to African countries and gave technology away to African countries. And made things better in those countries in that kind of direct way. And we could do that in ways that involve the kind of progressive deglobalization in terms of actual movement of goods and of people.
Okay. We've got now, this is interesting. We've got Sat's question. Does radical disruption of economic systems backfire if those who are unaware of an emergency are turned off by the short-term disruption caused in their lives and livelihoods?
Yeah, so obviously that's a risk, and obviously to some extent that's happened, right? So Extinction Rebellion is sort of somewhat divisive. But what I would stress is that there's a presupposition in your question that those who are unaware of the emergency remain unaware of the emergency. But the whole point of the Extinction Rebellion strategy, and it's very similar with this, with the climate school strikers, is to raise awareness of the emergency, and it's working. It's extremely clear that it's working. This is detailed in my book that you can get at the link that I put in the bottom of the Q&A there. But it's out there on the internet. If you look at the UK, for example, look at the polls before and after the rebellion that we undertook in April of 2019. There was a massive upsurge in awareness of and concern about the climate and the environment during and immediately after that rebellion. So some of the very people who said, well, I don't like those disruptive Extinction Rebellion people, were certainly the same people who actually ended up being more concerned about the climate than they were before. And that is part of our strategy. Part of our strategy is that by disrupting, we create difficult conversations. We force those difficult conversations upon nations and upon peoples. And it works. It doesn't always work exactly as we would like, and it works better in some cases than in others. And there are stupid ways that you can disrupt and just become really unpopular. And we've done a bit of that in the UK in Extinction Rebellion sometimes. But if and when you get it right, it transforms people's understanding of the situation and raises the emergency up most people's agendas.
Okay, Adam's asked a lot of questions, so I'm going to actually ask him onto the stage to ask his question, and then he can always do a follow-up. He asked the question about whether what he should say to his parents if they told him they were going to ruin his life. How are you doing? Your life still? You haven't ruined your life? Have you been on XR March?
No, I was actually considering taking part in Heathrow.
Well, you're a bit quiet.
We can't really hear you.
I was actually considering taking part in Heathrow Pause, which is a radical offshoot of XR, but my parents dissuaded me from that. It's quite hard because I live with them and so on and so forth.
So look, I think that may have been a good decision. I wasn't in favour of the Heathrow Pause actions. I think they were taking things too far. You can dip your toe in the pond much more gently than that.
Okay, but yeah.
So your question about transformative adaptation.
Sorry. Yeah, it's just a simple one actually. Can you give some, because I don't think we heard that many during your presentation. Can you give some examples of transformative adaptation?
Oh yes, you're right. I didn't give examples of transformative adaptation.
Things that adapt and mitigate, which is kind of
yeah. So starting with the example I gave of shallow adaptation, the counterpart of that in transformative adaptation would be things like restoring wetlands and changing where you build and the way you build. Or in other countries, it would be things like restoring mangrove swamps. And when you restore wetlands and mangrove swamps, then you can draw down carbon, improve the ecology, and you're obviously working with nature and not against nature at the same time. And I did mention that that the kind of relocalizing, lower energy, more food sovereign type approach in the transition towns movement is super compatible with transformative adaptation. For details of sort of further versions of transformative adaptation, you can look at my Extinction Rebellion book, or you can look at the Greenhouse book.
Brilliant. Thanks, Adam. I'm just going to bring
Nice to meet you.
Jane Ashley up because she's got a question which has been hovering up there. If you could switch, Jane, switch on your microphone and your camera and tell us about the small spatial communities you're working with. Jane, are you there? Is your camera working? Ah, here we go.
Yep.
Hi, Jane.
Yeah, I'm in southwest Scotland, so we've got communities, and I'm working with spatial communities. So a lot of different motivations, a lot of different areas of interest. So it's really hard to get something to get people to fix on. If we came up with Extinction Rebellion ideas that wouldn't necessarily fit in a small-scale rural community, I think they'd find it quite scary, and I think they'd find it difficult to get resonance with the language. So I wondered if you had any ideas of some really nice, sweet, simple messages that we could get people, motivated around.
Yeah. Well, I think it's what I've got is the kind of things I've already been saying, really. I totally take where you're coming from. I think maybe more than the Extinction Rebellion story, the transformative adaptation story, if you're looking for a kind of overarching picture, as it were, could work with the kind of communities you're talking about. And then if you're looking for more sort of detail within that, I would say change is coming. The only question is, do we embrace it and accept it, or do we try to resist it? And if we try to resist it, it'll end up being worse. Relocalization is coming, so why not get on the bus early, as it were, and help to make it happen again in an intelligent way rather than a catastrophic way. And I think you're quite well placed in southwest Scotland for some of this. I was in the Galloway area last New Year, and it's very striking that there's a lot of people around who are to some extent aware of these issues and are trying to move in this direction. And it's very striking also that there just aren't a lot of people around. In other words, that there's a lot of space in southwest Scotland, and that puts you at an advantage where this kind of future is concerned.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Ashley. Now, I think we're going to have to bring this to a close. Is there any last message you'd like to give before we finish off?
Well, I think I'd like to say, Henry, that it's been a really fascinating discussion with you and with the audience. I obviously haven't succeeded in provoking as much as I might have hoped to have done. I haven't heard a lot of kind of outraged or negative pushback, but perhaps that just goes to show either that I'm extremely convincing or that your audience members are already a highly thoughtful bunch who have been anticipating some of this kind of stuff. And on a serious note, I do often find this, that actually the kind of apparently unusual and initially seemingly negative message that I'm bringing is actually widely welcomed and to some extent already anticipated. I think there's an awful lot of speakers and intellectuals and so on out there who think something along the lines of, I have to have a fully positive message, I have to make people think that it's all going to be fine and so on, even if I don't really believe that myself, etc. And they end up not being very authentic and not engaging as deeply as you can engage when you really face up to how difficult the situation is, and when you therefore really start to engage in thinking about the appropriate responses. And that's what we've been doing, isn't it, the last half an hour? We've been talking about these difficult questions and what we should actually do in the situation that we're in, and people appreciate it, and it works. So I take from that, that's another thing that gives me hope, that these kinds of conversations, initially awkward though they may feel, are actually exactly what we need, it seems, and that people resonate with them.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Rupert, for giving us your time. And I think this has been a really useful provocation early in the process to really get people thinking about what sort of propositions, what sort of ideas they can come up with to adapt, to create action that will actually appropriate to the crises we face. So thanks very much, and
thank you.
Good night, everyone. You can stick around, the place is open. If you haven't already, update your profile so other people can see who you are and connect easily with you. As Rupert said, this is all about trying to connect people all around the world without having to jump on an aeroplane and travel miles. And it's much easier to make those connections if we can see who everyone is. And of course, you can go off to our networking area and chat one-to-one and so on. So do enjoy, and we look forward